Hello everyone, today we are going to study a very important physiology topic, and that is capillary fluid exchange. This is extremely important because it explains how the fluid moves between the capillaries and the interstitial spaces. And it also helps us to understand a very common clinical problem known to be as edema, right? So students often try to memorize the Starling forces as the four separate pressures, but the topic becomes much easier when we understand the logic first. So in this lecture, I will explain it in a smooth sequence. First, we will understand why the fluid moves at all. Then we will understand the four Starling forces. Then we will connect them into the Starling equation. And after that, we will understand what happens at the arterial end, right, and the venous end, right? And finally, we will connect everything to the edema and some of its causes too. So the first concept that you need to master, that is inside the body, the fluid or the blood inside our body, the fluid or the blood moves through the capillaries, right? And these capillaries are in close contact with the surrounding tissues. For example, if this is capillary, right, this has been in touch with the interstitial tissues, right? Interstitial tissues. And so the tissues need the exchange with the blood, and they need the oxygen, they need the nutrients, they need the removal of the weights, right? And also the movement of the fluid, right? All of these are major functions. So capillaries are not just the pipes carrying the blood, but they are also to be known as the exchange vessels. They are also to be known as the exchange vessels. So the first thing that you have to remember it out, that the fluid that is constantly moving out of the capillaries, all of that fluid which is moving outside of the capillaries into the interstitium, and also from the interstitium back into the capillaries, the direct amount of this movement depend upon certain forces, and such forces are actually known as the Starling forces, right? I briefly just repeat that whatever the fluid which is constantly moving out of this capillary, right, and going to the interstitiums, right, going to the interstitium, and whatever the fluid, right, from the interstitium coming back into the capillaries, right, all of this is actually handled by some of the forces known as the Starling forces. Okay, and so you can just try to capture up all of these ones. That what are the Starling forces? These are, we do have the four major different forces, right? And two of them are mainly the hydrostatic pressures, the hydrostatic pressures, right? And two of them are the oncotic pressures, oncotic pressures, right? So we are going to understand them one by one. The first one that we are going to touch up, that is the capillary hydrostatic pressure. Now this is denominated by the PC, as you're looking up over here, and because the blood is inside the capillary under the pressure, this pressure tends to push the fluid out of the capillary into the interstitium, right, from the capillary back into the interstitium. And so this is also to be known as, because this is sending out the fluid outward back into the interstitium, that is why we call it up as the outward force. This creates the outward force. And a simple way to think about it is that if you have the water inside a tube under the pressure tends to push the water outward. In the same way, capillary hydrostatic pressure pushes the fluid outward. So remember that the PC, this PC pushes the blood, or you can just say pushes the fluid out of the capillaries, right? And so if this is how, we can just say that this is promoting actually the filtration. This PC also promotes the filtration, right? Then we do have the interstitial hydrostatic pressure. Interstitial hydrostatic pressure. So this is the pressure in the fluid outside the capillaries, right, in the interstitial space, specifically in the interstitial space. And then the pressure tends to push the fluid into the capillary. So over here, this pushes the fluid into the capillary. So unlike the capillary hydrostatic pressure, this is an inward force. So this would be known as the inward force. Okay, you can just remember up that one. And so remember that this is PI, it is an inward force, PC, that is the outward force, right? Then we do have the plasma oncotic pressure, right? This actually pulls the fluid into the capillaries. Now this is known to be as the third force, right? And this is actually produced by the plasma proteins, This is produced by the plasma proteins and specifically the albumins. And now proteins cannot easily leave the capillary, so they stay inside the plasma and they create the osmotic pulling force, right? And this force tends to pull fluid into the capillary. And so we can just also call it this specific pi c to be also known as the inward force, right? And so this is very, very important clinically, because when the plasma protein level, when the plasma, do remember, when the plasma protein levels in the body falls, right, it means that the inward force is also lower. And so this becomes weaker and edema can develop. Why is that? Because the proteins which meant to hold up the pressure, right, inside into the capillaries, right, now the fluid is moving into the interstitial spaces and causing the edema, right? So in a very short manner, you can remember the normal one, that it pulls the fluid into the capillaries. Then we do have the interstitial fluid oncotic pressure with the pi I that you're looking up over here. And this pulls the fluid out of the capillary. So the fourth force, denominated by the pi I. And this is due to the proteins present in the interstitial spaces. So now not only the proteins are present in the capillaries, there are the proteins which are present in actually the interstitial spaces too. So if the proteins are present outside the capillary, they attract the water outward and towards the interstitium especially. So this force tends to pull the fluid out of the capillary, and so this is known to be as the outward force, right? The outward force. And now if we just try to understand the logic before the equation, the first one, you have to understand that fluid will move out of the capillary. The fluid will move out of the capillary when the outward forces are stronger, right? Only and only in this such a scenario, when the outward force which is pulling the fluid outward of the capillary, if they are stronger enough, only then the fluid will go out, right? And fluid will move into the capillary when the inward forces are stronger, right? And so the body is constantly balancing between actually the filtration, which is doing what? The forces promoting the filtration, and the body is balancing against the forces which is promoting the reabsorption. And this is what exactly this net fluid flow, which you are looking up over here, the Starling equation expresses mathematically. Now, you have to remember it out that the net fluid flow, which is been looking out over here, right? If this JV that you're looking is positive, before we break down, let's understand this. If this JV, the net fluid flow, is positive, we can just say that the net fluid movement is out of the capillary. The net fluid movement is out of the capillary. If this JV is negative, so we can just say that the net fluid movement is into the capillaries, right? And this KF, that is representing actually the coefficient, filtration coefficient, right? And this reflects how permeable the capillary is to the fluid. And also, if the KF is higher, the fluid movement become easier, right? If this KF is higher, right, we can just consider that the fluid is moving, or the fluid movement becomes easier, right? That is the net hydrostatic force. And since this PC pushes the fluid out, this PC pushes the fluid outward, and this PI, it pushes the fluid inward. And if we subtract the PI from the PC, right, that is the pi C into the pi I, what is going to happen out? This is to be known as the net oncotic pressure. This is the net oncotic force, right? So since the plasma oncotic pressure falls fluid into the capillary and the interstitial, the oncotic pressure pulls the fluid out, and this difference represents the opposing oncotic effect, right? Specifically to be called this one, right? And this is known as the reflection coefficient that you're looking up over here. This is the reflection coefficient. So this also tells us that how permeable the capillary is to proteins, right? So that is the whole explanation about this net fluid flow, right? And it usually just simply tells you that how permeable the capillary is to the proteins, right? The reflection coefficient, this one specifically. That's why they have mentioned over here. So if the capillary wall is very impermeable to the proteins, right, the oncotic force, what is going to happen out to the oncotic force? if the capillary wall, if our capillary wall is very impermeable to the protein, the oncotic force is going to be very, very effective. And if the proteins can leak across easily, then the oncotic force also becomes less effective. So this equation is actually simply telling us that the net fluid flow depends upon the hydrostatic forces pushing the fluid out minus oncotic forces pulling the fluid in, and modified by the permeability factors. So that is the full meaning. Okay, so now we can understand one of the other concept, that what happens along the capillary length. Now let us connect all this diagram and understand, right, the arterial and the venous ends of the capillary. At the arterial end of the capillary hydrostatic pressure is relatively higher. Okay, the pressure is relatively higher over here because this outward hydrostatic force is strong and the fluid tends to move out of the capillary, right? The pressure is higher, right? And so we wanted what? We wanted it to be going outward because this fluid wants to go outward. And this is specifically to be known as the filtration, right? So as the blood flows along the capillary towards the venous end, as long as it is going to the venous end, what is going to happen out? The capillary hydrostatic pressure also falls up. Why it has been falling out? Because the plasma, or why is that? Because now the fluid is going outward, right? But what about the plasma protein pressure specifically? What is going to happen out to that? The plasma oncotic pressure will remain relatively important over here. So by the time the blood reaches the venous end, the inward oncotic pull becomes stronger than the outward hydrostatic pressure. And as a result, the fluid tends to move into the capillaries. And that is called what? The reabsorption side, right? So at the arterial end, what you are going to look up, the filtration, and on the venous end, you are going to look out to the reabsorption. And that is the standard way to understand the capillary exchange, right? So why the hydrostatic pressure? You have to understand now why does the hydrostatic pressure falls along the capillary. Okay, why does this hydrostatic pressure is lower at the venous end and it's higher at the arterial end, right? So because as the blood flows through the capillary, energy is lost during the resistance, right? Due to the resistant energy kept on losing, so the pressure gradually falls. Okay, and this is why filtration is favored at the beginning of the capillary and reabsorption is favored later, right? Another important key concept that we need to got over here, that is the role of the lymphatics. Okay, because not all the filtered fluid returns directly into our capillary. Some of the excess fluid enters to our lymphatic system also, right? And that is eventually returned to the circulation. That is very important because if this excess fluid is not removed, it will accumulate into our interstitiums, right? And causing the edema. So lymphatics also helps to maintain the fluid balance and prevent the edema. And that point it becomes very important when we discuss the lymphatic obstruction. So why the edema specifically to be over here? Because first let's define edema. Edema means we do have the excess accumulation. We do have the excess accumulation of the fluids, okay, into the interstitial space. And this happens when the more fluid leaves the capillary than returns to it, and when the lymphatic drainage is also impaired, not working. So edema is basically a problem of imbalance in the capillary fluid exchange, right? One of the major causes of the edema, that is actually the increased capillary hydrostatic pressure. One of the reason is the increased capillary hydrostatic pressure, because if the capillary hydrostatic pressure rises, the more fluid is pushed out of the capillary, so filtration increases and edema can develop. A common example is happening during the heart failure. In the heart failure, especially when the venous pressure is elevated, capillary hydrostatic pressure also rises, causing the fluid moving out of into the tissues, right? So this is one of the very high yield. They may ask you that, okay, why does with the increased capillary pressure, right, the person having the heart failure having the edema? Why is that? You have to explain this reason, okay? And then we do have the increased capillary permeability in this such a scenario, right? If the capillary becomes more permeable, more fluid can escape into the interstitium, definitely This occurs usually when the body is fighting off with the inflammation, with the toxins, with the infections, with the burns. In all these conditions, the capillary barrier becomes leaky. And so even if the pressures are not dramatically changed, the fluid escapes more easily. So remember that increased permeability leads up to, or we can also say of that, with the increased capillary coefficient, right? This coefficient filtration, right? The more fluid outflow will be happen out, leading up to the edema, and some of the examples are toxins. Another cause that you can look up to, that is if the proteins accumulate in the interstitial space. If the proteins are accumulating in the interstitial space, they attract the water outward, and that increases the fluid movement into the tissues, and that is one of the major cause for this specific one is the lymphatic blockage, right? Because normally lymphatics remove the protein. Normally the lymphatic system is removing constantly the proteins from the interstitial spaces, but if we do have the lymphatic blockage, the lymphatic system is not working, what is going to happen out? The proteins start building up outside the capillary and pull more and more water into the interstitium. So remember, the increased pi I, or the interstitial fluid oncotic pressure, pulls the fluid out of the capillary and edema will happen out. Another thing that you have to remember it out, that whenever we do have the decreased plasma oncotic pressure, whenever we do have decreased plasma oncotic pressure, what is going to happen out? Because the plasma oncotic pressure normally pulls the fluid into the capillary. So the fall in the plasma protein reduces this inward pulling force, right? And afterwards, the fluid is not reabsorbed properly, and so happening out to be edema, right? And some of the conditions like the nephrotic syndrome that you're looking up over here, the nephrotic syndrome, what happens in nephrotic syndrome? Proteins are starting lost into the urine, right? In the liver failure, right? Usually in the liver failure, the protein synthesis is reduced. In the malnutrition, right? There is inadequate protein intake, right? So all of these lead to the low plasma albumin and therefore the low plasma oncotic pressure, leading up to all of that one. And all this collectively leading up to what? Edema. Okay, so the normal physiology, you're connecting with the pathology. I hope so that everything is clear, and this is why we need to understand physiology to understand clinical concept.